I don't quite know how to describe David Brooks' new book, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen, published by Random House. In one sense, the premise is quite simple, just as the title suggests. We learn from David how to know a person. He invites us to become illuminators who make others feel seen and significant through curiosity and charity. By contrast, diminishers make others feel small through assumptions and stereotypes, all while drawing attention to themselves. In another sense, the book makes me wonder why we don't talk more about such an important subject, this constant practice of relating to one another. We can learn the wonders of physics and details of geography so we can compete on Jeopardy, and yet we may never really learn how to love and to be loved. David writes, quote, "As a society, we have failed to teach the skills and cultivate the inclination to treat each other with kindness, generosity, and respect." David Brooks is a New York Times columnist, a writer for The Atlantic, and a best-selling author of books such as The Second Mountain and The Road to Character. He's also a generous and repeated guest here on Gospelbound. In his latest book, you'll find wisdom about what's most important in life. David writes, quote, "Wisdom is knowing about people. Wisdom is the ability to see deeply into who people are and how they should move in the complex situations of life." So David joins me now to discuss what the Bible means by knowing, why he writes more about culture than politics, how suffering helps us empathize, and more. David, welcome back to Gospelbound.
It's good to be back with you, Colin. Thank you for having me.
Now, David, you have written many best-selling books, but what do you think it is about this book that seems to have caught on so deeply and so broadly with readers?
Yeah, I have to say, my book came out on October 24th, and when October 7th happened, I thought, well, that's just going to bury my book. Nobody will ever be paying attention. And indeed, a lot of media interviews got canceled as everyone focused their attention on the Middle East. But it turned out that it made people hungrier for the book, because the book is about the nuts and bolts, the details of how do you build a friendship, how do you get to know someone. I walk people through in very practical ways, from the first moment you gaze on someone all the way through serious things like how to have conversations with somebody who's suffering from depression who disagrees with you. So it's really nuts and bolts. And it turned out the atmosphere had grown even more vicious and hostile in the United States. And so people seized on the book as maybe a recipe for how we can make life a little more pleasant. And so sometimes when you publish a book, you're getting attention for it is like pushing a boulder up a hill. But this time it was like pushing a boulder down a hill. All I had to give was the slightest shove, and people were hungry for it. So I'm very sad for the world, what's happened over the last 10 years. But as so often in the media, what's bad for the world is good for the journalist.
True statement there from one journalist to another. Now, there is so much about this book that is uplifting, things that'll be very interesting along the themes of what we do here at Gospelbound, where we keep looking until we see God working. And I would love for you to tell us more about Pastor Jimmy Durrell. I loved what you wrote about him. I'm going to quote it here, that he is trying to see them with Jesus' eyes that lavish love on the meek and lowly, the marginalized, and those in pain, and on every living person. When Jimmy sees a person, he comes in with the belief that this person is so important that Jesus was willing to die for their sake. As a result, Jimmy is going to greet people with respect and reverence. That's how he's always greeted me, end quote. Just love to hear more, David, about what makes Jimmy a model for how to know a person.
Yeah, this is in the chapter on that first encounter, that first casting of attention. So I was in a diner in Waco, Texas, and I'm having breakfast with a lady named LaRue Dorsey. And Mrs. Dorsey was a 93-year-old lady who'd been a teacher. And she presents herself to me as this strict disciplinarian, sort of a tough, intimidating woman. And I was a little like, whoa, I'm a little scared of her. And so Jimmy Durrell, who has a church in Waco, or had one called Church Under the Bridge, which serves the homeless, and they used to meet in a highway overpass under the bridge, under a highway, where the homeless are. And it's a beautiful church. So Jimmy walks into the diner. He sees me and Mrs. Dorsey there, and he comes over to us. He grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders, and he shakes her way harder than you should ever shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best. You're the best. I love you. I love you. And that strict disciplinarian lady I'd been talking to turns into a bright, eyes shining 9-year-old girl.
Wow.
The lesson is the kind of attention you cast creates the kind of person who will encounter you. And as you read, Jimmy sees everybody he sees. He sees made in the image of God. This person's made in the image of God. I'm looking into the face of God. And you can be Christian or not Christian, but seeing everybody you meet with that level of reverence and respect is an absolute precondition for seeing them well. And it shows the power of attention. Attention is a moral act. If you look for danger, you're going to find threat. If you look for things that are criticism, you're going to find people messing up. But if you look with the eyes of love, you're going to see people doing the best they can. And so Simone Weil, this mystical writer in World War II, said that attention is the ultimate moral act. The way we attend to the world is how we show up in the world. And her great student, Iris Murdoch, the philosopher and novelist, said, we normally look at the world with self-centered eyes. The world is something for me to use. But our goal, she writes, is to cast a just and loving attention on the world. Just, so we're discriminating, but we're loving. Just grow by looking. And I think that power of attention is really at the core of Iris Murdoch's philosophy and Simone Weil's philosophy. And as I was reading about it, I remember years ago when I first encountered it, I ran across an interview that Mother Teresa gave to Dan Rather. And Dan Rather said, what do you say to God when you pray? And Mother Teresa says, well, I don't really say anything. I just listen. And then Dan Rather says, well, what is God saying to you when you pray? And she says, oh, he's not saying anything to me. He's just listening. And that idea of God and us listening to each other in sort of a mystical encounter, to me, it's a very beautiful idea.
Let's keep along these biblical lines. You observe that in the Bible, knowing can involve studying, having sex with, showing concern for, entering into a covenant with, being familiar with, or understanding the reputation of. That's a good example of the diversity, especially of the Hebrew language there. God, of course, is the perfect knower. He sees perfectly with an objective eye for intricate science, but also with the gracious eye of perfect love. You talk about this in the book. I'm wondering, other than Jesus, who is the obvious example we referred to earlier, does anybody else stand out to you in Scripture as someone who strives to see and know as God does? Maybe somebody who inspires you in particular.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things the Bible gets right, I don't, I feel like odd saying that sentence, is that in our culture, we've erected a barrier between reason and emotion. And this is the Enlightenment idea that I guess we associate with René Descartes, the French philosopher, that reason is the opposite of emotion. If you're going by your emotion, you're not going by reason. And this is an Enlightenment invention, and it's not true. Modern neuroscientists has totally proved this. There's a guy named Antonio Damasio who studies people who can't process emotion. They've had brain lesions, and they really can't feel anything. And these people are not super smart Mr. Spocks. They're incapable of leading normal life because what your emotions are, they're valuation systems. They tell you what you value. And if you can't assign value to different things, you can't make a rational decision. And so emotion and reason are part of the same process. And the Bible understood this perfectly well with all these different concepts of knowing. And Parker Palmer once had a great speech that's available online if anybody wants to Google it, called The Violence of Our Knowledge. And he said, don't want to look at the world with a dispassionate eye, with an objective eye, with a systematizing eye where we step back in a lab coat. We want to look at the world with a personal. We want to try to know the world personally. We want to try to know it tenderly. And so the whole voice, the whole biblical metaphysic is based on this much richer conception of reason. And so when I think of the biblical characters who really seek to know and understand, I think they're all flawed, but, David in the Psalms, there's just a lot. He comes immediately to mind. Moses is an example of a leader in that he pushes away the mantle of leadership. He's described as the most humble person on earth. And I do think humility is the essence of being able to see others, because you have to get out of your own way. And one of the things that's beautiful about Moses, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks used to make this point, that in the book of Genesis, the creation of the universe is described in just a few verses. In the book of Exodus, the creation of the tabernacle
Yeah.
it takes hundreds and hundreds of verses to describe the building
Yeah.
of this cubit of wood and whatever it is. It's all kind of boring to me, but it's there. And Rabbi Sachs asks, why does it take hundreds of verses? And it's because that Moses is trying to unify fractious tribes. And to unify fractious people into divided people, they need two things. They need a common story, which the Exodus is the creation of that story, and they need a common project, something to build together. And so the building of the tabernacle is a very sophisticated psychological act of putting the tribes together into a people. And so I'll give Moses a tab for somebody who really had some understanding of human psychology.
Yeah, he certainly needed all of it with all the different leadership challenges that he faced in multiple directions. David, early in your career, you were known especially for your political reporting, and you still cover politics regularly in your New York Times column. It does seem, though, and certainly this is the case with your books, you write more often about culture. How did you make that change?
Yeah, I've always been sort of a cultural determinist. Some people are technological determinists. They think whatever technology that's what shapes society. And some people are economic determinists, that our economic structures shape society. I think our societies are fundamentally shaped by our norms, by our values, by our unconscious assumptions about what is good and what is to be admired and what is to be disdained. And so I've always tried to focus on culture. And I think it's especially important now because I do think our political problems flow from a cultural phenomenon. And that cultural phenomenon is the spiritual and relational disintegration of society. And so there are a whole bunch of statistics, some of which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. The rise in depression, the 30% rise in suicide, 40 or 50% rise in teenage suicide. But then other things that just are mysterious. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends has gone up fourfold since 2000. The number of people not in a romantic relationship has increased by a third. The number of people who say no one knows them well is 54% of Americans. Since 2000, the number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category has risen by 50%. And so these are all just very intimate. It's about the intimate life of the country, that people are spending more time alone, have less good relationships, less good friendships, and they're sad. We become sadder as a country. And when a country becomes meaner, or sadder, it becomes meaner. Because people, we are here to be surrounded and have other people looking out for us. And when we feel alone, unseen, then we feel under threat and we lash out. And so to me, this is the fundamental problem in American society right now. And you're not going to solve our politics unless you solve the viciousness and isolation within our culture.
I certainly believe, David, and this is a big belief of this podcast, that of what you're talking there about the cultural effects on our politics. It's downstream from a lot of these changes. And we'll have James Davison Hunter as a future guest talking about his new book, Democracy and Solidarity. Jean Twenge with all her research, especially on younger generations in there, on and on and on. These are themes that we come back to repeatedly here, but I don't think we can emphasize them enough because it seems as though we keep skating along the surface of these problems and not digging into what's really happening underneath. But I certainly think that, David, that your cultural writing makes you a more astute political observer. And here's an example from this book. You say, quote, "For people who feel disrespected and unseen, politics is a seductive form of social therapy. Politics seem to be a comprehensible moral landscape. We, the children of light, are facing off against them, the children of darkness. Politics seems to offer a sense of belonging. I am on the barricades with the other members of my tribe. And politics seems to offer an arena of moral action. To be moral in this world, you don't have to feed the hungry or sit with the widow. This is the idea that you're categorizing here. You just have to be liberal or conservative. You just have to feel properly enraged at the people you find contemptible," end quote. I'm wondering, David, do you see any hope for escaping this last decade's politicization of everything?
Yeah, I think I do. I've among other things, I've founded a nonprofit called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and we lift up those who work in the communities where they live. And so these are people there's a guy in Houston named Pancho Arguelles, And he takes men who've suffered from construction accidents and are paralyzed, and he gives them wheelchairs and diapers and catheters. He trains them in social work. And so you'll be in Houston, and 25 guys in wheelchairs will roll into your neighborhood to do social work in your neighborhood, help fix your neighborhood up, help you. And I once said to Pancho, you radiate holiness. And he replied, no, I reflect holiness, which is a good answer. And so I've spent the last, really, since 2018, traveling around the country, and we go to a town, and it could be a big city like New Orleans, it could be a small place like Wilkes, North Carolina, or McCook, Nebraska, and we say, who's trusted here? And immediately people give us names, and often they're the same names. And so when I go to any town, I find there are these people we call weavers, repairing the neighborhood they live in. Sometimes they're taking care of the homeless. Sometimes they're helping to tutor a kid. Sometimes it's more informal. They just have meals together. We ran into a lady who said, I practice aggressive friendship. And so she's the person in the block who invites people over, who has the picnics. Aggressive friendship doesn't have to be some formal thing. And we met a lady in Florida who was helping kids cross the street after elementary school. And we asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she says, no, I have no time. And we said to her, well, are you getting paid for this? And she said, no, but I help the kids across the street after school. And we said, well, what are you doing the rest of the day? And she said, well, on Thursdays, I bring food to the hospital so the people have some nice things to eat. And we said, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? She said, no, I have absolutely no time. And to her, that wasn't volunteering. That was just being a neighbor. And so the hope I have comes from encounters like this in every place in America. And I'm sure all of us listening can think of those people in their communities who are the weavers. And so I do think there's a big counterattack on some of the things that are tearing us apart. I also think, and I differ with my friend Robert Putnam, whose work I tremendously admire, who writes a lot about what he calls the me, we, me curve, that in the 1890s we were very individualistic. And then in the 1950s or 60s, we were more communal. And we made racial progress, we had less polarization, we had more activity in civic life, all sorts of good things happened. And then starting about the mid-60s, we started going back to a more individualistic culture. And I happen to think we've had 60 or 70 years of extreme individualism in this country. But we're beginning to turn it around. And we're now fighting over what kind of community we want. But at least I think so many people are valuing community and relationship now. We've just got to figure out how to build it.
Yeah. Talking here with David Brooks about how to know a person, the art of seeing others deeply and being deeply seen. I think, David, you probably just answered this question, but I'll give you a chance to expand. Here's another astute observation from you in this book. Quote, the person practicing the politics of recognition is not trying to formulate domestic politics or to address this or that social ill. He is trying to affirm his identity, to gain status and visibility, to find a way to admire himself. Again, very astute observation there. I'm wondering, David, address Christians here who want to engage in politics, to love their neighbors. How can they get involved without falling into that identity trap that you just identified there?
Yeah, I think first to understand, as our friend Andy Crouch says, recognition is the first human quest. That a baby comes out of the womb looking for a face that will see it. And if you go online and Google still face experiments, you'll see what happens when mothers are told to not respond to their children's bids for attention. They just sit there still face. Within 30 seconds, the babies are hysterically upset. Yeah. We need that recognition. And so to offer each other the recognition on a human level. And one of the things to remember is we can't imagine our way into somebody else's mind. We can't say, oh, I'm going to put myself in your shoes, because people are too different from one another. And so the core of any kind of relationship, and especially a political relationship, is conversation, is being really good at conversation. And so in the book, I have a whole list of tips on how to be a better conversationalist. And some of them are things like, speaking of Andy Crouch, be a loud listener. So when you talk to Andy, it's like talking to a charismatic church. He's like going, yeah, man, amen, preach, yes. I love talking to that guy.
That's true.
Another tip I got was, don't be a topper. And so if you tell me, oh, I had this bad flight, we sat on the tarmac for 2 hours, my instinct would say, I know exactly what you're going through. I had a bad flight and we sat on the tarmac for 6 hours. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate, but really what I'm saying is let's not pay attention to your inferior experiences. Let's talk about my more important experiences. And so
Right.
don't be a topper. And so these are just skills like learning to play tennis, learning carpentry. Being a great conversationalist is a skill. And when we're getting involved in politics, there's often people who are going to disagree with us profoundly. And I've found that persuasion is not 80% talking and 20% listening. Persuasion is 80% listening and 20% talking. And so when somebody comes at me from a different political point of view, my first job is to stand in their standpoint. It's to say, tell me what I'm missing about your point of view. Tell me again, tell me again. And they may not persuade me, but at least I'll have shown them the respect that I'm curious about their point of view. And then the other final tip I've learned as a journalist is I never ask people, what do you believe? I ask people, how did you come to believe that? And that way they're not giving me an argument. They're telling me a
About a
story
story.
about an experience or somebody who shaped their values and caused them to believe that way. And so suddenly it's a much more human encounter when you're telling stories.
Wasn't our late friend Tim Keller a good example of the listener listening to persuade?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's now public, and that I think it's public because of your book. That I was in a book club with Tim, and Tim had the knowledge and the ability. Every our meeting of our book club could have been a press conference with Tim Keller. Like, we could have just sat there and peppered him with questions. And said
Yeah.
he let us talk, and I'm sure he knew this stuff material way better than any of us did. But he let us. We had an even conversation, and Tim was just a beautiful example of someone who certainly had the knowledge and the brain power just to dominate every room he walked into, but he didn't because he had that basic humility.
Yeah, it was one of the things that I learned in the process of working on that book. I thought, what did this guy do to strategize coming to New York City? What were the books he read? And I did a lot. I was kind of doing my imitation David Brooks. I was looking at all this stuff, Wolf of Wall Street things that originated mid-1980s, things like that. And some of that they were significant factors. The biggest factor was just sitting down in a diner and listening to people, listening to them about their questions, listening, going back, studying, coming back, listening some more. And I think that's a good example of the way that evangelism, which is obviously a form of persuasion, works today. We listen, and as people listen, we learn. And as we learn, then we get an opportunity to share our own perspective and to continue that dialogue. Another example of this from your book, just in terms of how we relate to one another, again, the whole point of the book, is the relationship between empathy and suffering, a pattern we see over and over in Scripture, and we just have known it from our own lives as well. But it's not that everybody who suffers is empathetic, you point out, but the empathetic have seemingly always suffered. So help us understand, David, how do we turn our pain into a means to understand and connect with others?
There's a saying, I forget who came up with this phrasing, but suffering can either break you or break you open. And it breaks you by thinking, oh, I'm in pain, I'm going to cover, I'm going to protect, I'm going to callous myself over, so I don't want to feel anything. And breaking open is becoming more vulnerable, more feeling. And of course, Jesus is the ultimate example of someone who confronts suffering and then is broken open and becomes more, well, I don't know if he gets more loving, but he refuses to harden himself. He refuses to put up his emotional guard, but just has those soft eyes of loving attention. Paul Tillich is a 1950s theologian, and he once wrote that moments of suffering interrupt your life and remind you you're not the person you thought you were. He says they carve through what you thought was the floor of the basement of your soul and reveal a cavity below. And then they carve through that and reveal another cavity below. So in those moments of suffering, you see depths of yourself you might not have even been aware of. And I think when you see those depths, you realize that only spiritual and relational food will fill those depths. And so I think the hard part about suffering is you just want to protect, and you want to go through the world with eyes sensitive to threat, but saying, no, I'm not going to react that way. I'm not going to cover myself over, is an act of raw courage. And I'm a big fan of Fred Buechner, the novelist and pastor. And his dad, when he was 9, took his own life. And the mom took Buechner and his brother, I think, to the Bahamas or Bermuda, one of those two, and never mourned, never went to the funeral. And so he never really saw into the depths of himself till middle age. And so he didn't cry for like 30 years after his dad's death. By the end of his life, he was crying every day. And he learned you have to operate from your depths and not from your shallows. And I think his story is a great example of someone who didn't face suffering, but then finally had the courage to confront it head on.
Along with suffering, leadership will expose those depths that you're not the person you thought, in part because leadership brings suffering, in part because of the difficulties that you face, but also what you're exposed to in others, just what you encounter there. I'd love for you to talk us through a little bit more of this point. You say, a generative leader serves the people under him, lifts other people's vision to higher heights, and helps other people become better versions of themselves. A lot of folks listening, watching this podcast, they're leaders in a variety of different capacities in the marketplace, the church. How can a leader grow and mature into that vision?
Yeah, I mean, I will cite an even higher authority, Ted Lasso. And so in the first season of his show, Ted Lasso, he's asked by a journalist, what are your goals for FC Richmond, this soccer team? And he says, I'm just trying to help the fellows on this team become better versions of themselves on and off the field. And to me, that's the ultimate definition of moral formation. I'm just trying to help the people around me become better versions of themselves in work and out of work. And so it's that attention to moral growth. And this phrase, moral formation, can sound fancy, but really it's 3 things. It's 1, trying to find ways to restrain our natural selfishness. 2, it's the ability to have an ideal and to worship something that's worth worshiping. And 3rd, it's the skill of being considerate to people in the concrete circumstances of life. And so how do you sit with someone who's depressed? How do you break up with someone without destroying their heart? How do you host a dinner so everybody feels included? And so some of these are just basic skills. And for leaders, I think having a meeting where every voice is heard and maybe where you speak last instead of first. And these are just basic leadership skills. And mostly, I think, that my definition of wisdom has turned around writing this book. I used to think a wise person was like Yoda, or somebody uttering profound maxims. Now I think the wise person is the one able to receive somebody else's story and put themselves in the journey that person is going through and to see a world a little from their point of view. And the ability to see the world from another person's point of view is the ultimate and very difficult thing. And we're never going to do it all the way. But if we can do it a little, then we will make people feel really known and you'll light up their life. Well, researching the book, I would ask people, tell me about a time you felt seen. And often it was when some authority figure, often a teacher or a boss, just understood what they were going through. And so just a quick example, one woman, and there's a trivial example, she was in her 40s, and she said, when I was 13, I had my first taste of alcohol, and I got so drunk I couldn't move. My friends dumped me on the front porch. I just lay there. And my dad, who was this strict guy, came out, and I thought he would scream at me all the things I was thinking about myself. I'm bad, I'm bad. Instead, he just picked her up, scooped her in his arms, brought her inside, lay her on the sofa, and said, there'll be no punishment here. You've had an experience. And she remembered, it's not a big event, but she remembered it 3 or 4 decades later because her dad understood, I don't need to scream at her right now. She understands. And it just leaves a huge mark on people when you show some appreciation of how they're seeing the world.
Got a couple more questions here with David Brooks on how to know a person. I was just preaching last week, David, in Atlanta. I was on the parables of Jesus in Matthew 13, and I made a comment that you can either have friends or you can be free, but you can't have both. And I think that was probably inspired by reading your book. How do we reconcile these opposites, friendship, freedom?
Yeah, well, I think there are two kinds of freedom. There's the one which is absence of restraint. And then the second kind of freedom is to have the ability to do something. So if I want to have the
Yeah.
freedom to play the piano, I have to chain myself down and practice the piano every day.
Yeah.
And so in those circumstances, it's our chains that set us free. It's the commitments we make. And most of us make four big
Yeah.
commitments in a life. We make a commitment to our creator, to a faith commitment. We make a family commitment, most of us. We make a commitment to a vocation and to a community. And making the outcome of one's life depends on how well one's choose and then execute those commitments. And so I like to say that a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. So Jews love God, but they keep kosher just in case. Like they need that structure of behavior. I love my wife, but we're in a marriage because it builds a structure of behavior around our
Yeah.
love. Going to church every Sunday, it's a structure of behavior around love of God. So it's not just like free form. And so I think our friendships, we would not say our friends inhibit our freedom. They might if we don't want to do something and they're ailing and we have to go deal with them. And in some sense, I guess our kids restrain our freedom because got to take care of them all the time when they're young. And yet, I think very few people with friends or with children would say, I'm in prison here. uh, you're
Yeah.
in the tunnel if your kid's a little. You're in a tunnel, but you chose the tunnel, and there's a greater freedom that comes out of that, which is the ability to just love more deeply than you ever knew.
Yeah. Amen. Um, how do you see your writing having developed in the last few years, especially with some of the changes and maturing in your own personal faith?
Yeah, I hope I've become more spiritually open. I hope I've become more emotionally open.
Yeah.
And so I think, I, as a journalist, I was rewarded for being aloof. What we do as
Yeah.
journalists, we observe, and we don't
Hmm.
often get intimate. And people think people go into journalism because they love talking to people because what we do is we interview. But in fact, a lot of people go into journalism because they're so socially awkward. They need the structure of their interview to have a human encounter. And so a lot of people in my profession are socially quite awkward, even though our job is to interview people.
It's true.
And so I certainly fit into that pattern. I was aloof. And I decided, I think maybe 20 years ago, that this was not an adequate way to live. As Buechner says, if you shut yourself off from human vulnerability, you've shut yourself off from the holy sources of life itself. And then about 10 years ago, I came to faith. And I think that was another opening. And now I think I'm not all the way there, Lord knows, but I think I'm more spiritually and emotionally available for other people. And I can do things I never could have done. So I was at a conference about a year or two ago in Nantucket, and we're meeting in a building, and the speaker hands out these pieces of paper to everybody in the crowd. And they're on the paper are lyrics to a love song. And the speaker directs us to find some stranger in the room, gaze lovingly into their eyes, and sing the love song into the stranger. And if you had asked me to do this like
Boy.
20 years ago, I would have spontaneously combusted. But I did it. I found some guy, I sang a little love song in his eyes, and I was emotionally open to some stranger.
Oh, the strange places the Lord leads us. Speaking of which, last question, David, where do you want to go next in your writing?
There's always the world to discover. So, I have a newspaper column, so I'm probably writing about the Middle East. I think the thing that interests me most, which may be my next book, we'll see, is our definition of human ability. And so we have a meritocracy. People get into graduate from high school, go to college, or go to competitive colleges based on a certain definition of merit, which is very cognitive. It's getting good grades, scoring high on your standardized tests. And to me, this definition of merit is needs to be replaced, in part because it's unfair. Rich people have a huge advantage at every measure. So if you go to the elite schools, it's mostly rich kids because only rich kids can have been invested in enough to get into Princeton, Yale, Harvard. Second, AI is going to make our definition of intelligence obsolete because
good point.
everything that we do in school, AI can already do. It's great at writing papers. It's great at taking tests. So we have to have a more humane definition of intelligence. And finally, it's not that effective. Doing well in a school predicts nothing about how you're going to do in life. And so it's not a good way to sort people. And so I'd like to, my main cause in the last 20 or 30 years is to try to fight back against the forces of dehumanization on behalf of the forces of humanization. And if we could have a definition that takes all our abilities, our courage, our spirituality, our character, our hunger, all the things that really matter in a person, faithfulness, the ability to be a kindness. If we could measure people by that and sort people by that, we'd have a more humane society, and we wouldn't be so divided along educational grounds as we are now.
Turning to anthropology, I keep hearing that is one of the most important areas to be looking at culturally, theologically. Sounds appropriate. I want to end with this quote. It's kind of almost a benediction of sorts, I think, for what we talked about. You say, an illuminator is a blessing to those around him. When he meets others, he has a compassionate awareness of human frailty because he knows the way we are all frail. He is gracious toward human folly because he's aware of all the ways we are foolish. He accepts the unavoidability of conflict and greets disagreement with curiosity and respect. David, thank you for helping us become illuminators in this book, How to Know a Person, the Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. Thanks.
It's a pleasure. I'm grateful for you having me on the show.